Good afternoon. I want to welcome you all to our C. Marston annual lecture. As some of you know, later this year we're going to be celebrating our 125th anniversary of our university. But today we have the privilege of remembering someone who was associated with the university nearly from its inception and over half of its history. Specifically, we have the opportunity to pause this afternoon to remember Professor C. Marston, who was known in her lifetime as the Legend. Born in 1877, she attended high school in Alexander Hall, when we were known as the Seattle Seminary, and she graduated in 1898, just 7 years after the university was founded. She earned her bachelor's degree from our sister school at Greenville College in Illinois, and her master's degree from the University of Washington. And she first joined the faculty of the then newly christened Seattle Pacific College in 1902, where she taught Latin, Greek, English, French, and German for 56 years. At the 1952 SPC graduation, she was given an honorary doctorate, and her citation for the degree in part read, "We honor you as a teacher, a real teacher who has won your way into the hearts and lives of hundreds of young people. We honor you as a colleague, one who understands, one who is loyal and dependable. We honor you because of your sympathetic understanding and the modest yet effective manner in which you have insisted upon adhering to standards." It'd be interesting to unpack that phrase. We honor you for what you have meant to Seattle Pacific College through your multiplied gifts, but we honor you most because of your fine Christian spirit, your exemplary life, your devotion to Christian education, and to the cross of Jesus Christ. The endowment that is used to support this lecture was given by Dr. Marston's longtime friend, and then really another legend in her own right here, Dr. Winifred Wheater. And we are extraordinarily grateful for the contribution of these two women, as today we are extraordinarily grateful for the contribution of our colleague, Dr. Owen Edwald. I'll turn this over now to Dr. Margaret Diddams.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. I noticed that the crocus, I'm debating is it croci or crocuses, are out around Alexander Hall, and so I am very grateful that you have chosen the better path to join us this afternoon for the lecture rather than to be outside with the flute and the guitar. I'm Margaret Diddams. I'm the assistant provost here. I'm also the director for the Center of Scholarship and Faculty Development, and it has been my joy to introduce Dr. Owen Edwald now for 6 years. Although, Professor Edwald, it's getting more difficult to come up with creative things to say. So if you could do something naughty in the next year, I appreciate it. Those of you who know Owen, you can only, well, you can't really think of anything it's really naughty. So, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. Last night, as my husband and I were debriefing each other on our prior days, I mentioned that today would be our annual Marston Lecture and that our colleague, Owen Edwald, would be talking about ancient science fiction. Perhaps when you saw the title, you had the same expression on your face as my husband did, who, by the way, has a fine liberal arts background. He said, "Isn't all ancient mythology a form of science fiction?" He was, nevertheless, an econ major. A question that perhaps is not stated out loud in polite academic company amongst the arts and humanities, but nevertheless is worth pondering. If mythology reflects back to us the retelling of our own cultural stories, what are the differences among mythology, fantasy, and science fiction? Are they not all on the continuum of truth-telling that calls into question our cultural understanding of personification, probabilities, and possibilities? I don't know the answer, but fortunately, Professor Owen Edwald is about to answer it. Since 2005, Dr. Edwald has been the C. Marston Professor of Classics here at SPU. He received his doctorate in classics from the University of Washington, where he studied Roman historiography. He has also studied Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. His articles on ancient funerary practices, ancient roads, and Virgil's rhyme schemes have appeared in the Athenaeum, Bryn Mawr Classical Review, and Harvard Studies in Classical Philology. Professor Edwald has taught Latin, Greek, classical literature, ancient history, and art history at Seattle Pacific University since 2001. Professor Edwald.
Welcome to our Marston Lecture about science fiction, fantasy, and classics. A few things are in order. Center for Scholarship and Faculty Development, especially Jen Wilson, and Associate Provost Margaret Diddams, Dean Deborah Sakara, and Provost Jeff Van Duzer, and President Martin. I also want to give a brief thanks to my graduate school professors seated in the audience, and my colleagues from my department, and from my hallway. From my hallway, I want to single out my colleague April Mendlesohn, who pointed me to the best theorists and critics in sci-fi and fantasy, and really helped me sort the gold from the dross. April's contribution is especially evident in my overall message and claim. And what I'm not going to claim. First, I'm not going to make a claim of literary ancestry. I'm not going to claim that Captain Kirk of Star Trek is a descendant of the Greek ruler Alexander the Great. Nor am I going to claim that there is no Jules Verne, a French sci-fi author, without Lucian of Samosata, an ancient Greek, perhaps even Greek-Iraqi sci-fi author. What I am going to claim is that the more fantastical or speculative fictions of the ancient world will look different under the light of fantasy or science fiction. We live in a post-Tolkien, post-Doctor Who world, and we cannot pretend to have read nothing more recent than Burton's translation of the Arabian Nights. I found it particularly helpful to dip into the scholarly literature on fantasy and science fiction, for its categories are often more useful than the traditional ancient ones. Ancient literary theory often stresses form, prose versus poetry, history versus drama, lyric poetry versus epic poetry, or even tragic drama versus comic drama. In other words, indeed, ancient theory focuses on form much more than content. Modern theory includes features like plot, character, or even the philosophical or theological assumptions of a literary work. Also, I've tried to generate modern examples for many of the ideas from literary theory, but if you think of some better ones, well, let me know. One modern schema I found especially helpful is Farah Mendlesohn's division in her 2008 book, Rhetorics of Fantasy, into 4 different types: portal quest, immersive, intrusive, and liminal fantasy. Mendlesohn is an author as well as a critic, so the stakes for her are especially high. Her categories work quite well for the ancient literature, as I will show. For example, one classic portal quest fantasy is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the wardrobe of the title serves as a gateway into the world of Narnia, a world suffused with magic, both shallow and deep magic. Another modern example would be The Wizard of Oz, but the portal is opened by a tornado or magic shoes. I'll read this passage here. Dorothy now took Toto up solemnly in her arms, and having said one last goodbye, she clapped the heels of her shoes together 3 times, saying, "Take me home to Aunt Em." Instantly she was whirling through the air, so swiftly that all she could see or feel was the wind whistling past her ears. The silver shoes took but 3 steps, and then she stopped so suddenly that she rolled over upon the grass several times before she knew where she was. Note that the film is different. For instance, you can see that the silver shoes of the book have morphed into the ruby slippers of the film. There they are. Also note that Dorothy's words from the 1939 MGM movie, "There's no place like home," are much less specific, but much more iconic and quotable. The screenplay for the movie was written by 3 people, including Noel Langley, a fantasy author in his own right. His novel, The Land of Green Ginger, is worth reading, although it's more like the Arabian Nights than Oz. Portal quest fantasies in the ancient world include Aeneid Book 6, which featured the hero Aeneas' trip to the underworld to consult his dead father Anchises. There's a fair amount of the underworld in this talk, how you get there and get back, and I want to mark it as fiction, as untrue, especially when it gets a little bit on the spooky side. In the following passage, the portal is opened by the Golden Bough. The Golden Bough lies hidden in a dark tree, golden with leaves and with a tough stem, a bough called sacred to Proserpina, queen of the dead. All the grove covers this bough, and shadows enclose it in dark valleys. Yet one may not go beneath the concealed places of the earth before plucking the golden leaf and sprout from the tree. The bough on the slide probably by a Christian artist, now in the collection of the Vatican. It's not seen extra golden. There we go. But Aeneas is holding it in such a way as to suggest the Christian custom of austerities, wetting a branch and flicking water at a Christian congregation to remind them of their baptism. It may not be a coincidence that baptism opens the gate of heaven. If that comparison seems excessively theological, note the similarity between the golden bough and the golden ticket of Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, another Portal Quest fantasy. The next category, immersive fantasy, in Mendelssohn's words, quote, must assume that the reader is as much a part of the world as those being read about, end quote. Modern examples include Gregory Maguire's Wicked, which takes place almost entirely in Frank Baum's Oz. But note that the immersive fantasy of Wicked is based on a portal fantasy, The Wizard of Oz. Ancient immersive fantasies include the main narrative of Apuleius' Metamorphoses, where magic is a feature of this world and we cannot get outside it. Magic transforms the hero unwillingly into a donkey, like the cigar-huffing boys in Disney's Pinocchio. And in the following passage, the intervention of the goddess Isis, shown here with the moon hat, transforms the hero back into a human, provided that he eats a wreath of roses from her altar. Then, fearful, and with a heart thumping with a constant beat, yet eager for the goddess's promise, I wolfed down with a greedy maw the wreath which was shining, woven from lovely roses. The divine promise did not deceive me. Immediately, the wild and ugly exterior begins to slide away from me. First, the dirty bristles actually fall off. Next, my thick skin grows thin, my tubby stomach retreats, and the soles of my feet change from hooves into fingers and toes. My hands are no longer feet, but are extended for upright tasks. My forward-pointing neck is pulled back. My face and head become round, and my large ears regain their earlier smallness. My rock-like teeth revert to human scale, and the thing which earlier kept bothering me the most, no more tail. The peoples are amazed, and as they stretch their hands to heaven, the believers revere with a clear and harmonious voice so obvious a display of power of a very powerful goddess, the ease of transformation, and a great display like dream images. I rearranged this translation slightly to emphasize the last phrase, a great display like dream images. The entire work is a dreamlike feeling, and it's unclear whether the narrator or whether the reader ever truly wakes up. Instead, the reader remains within the immersive fantasy. Intrusive fantasies, by contrast, feature the following trajectory. Mendelssohn describes it thus. Quote, the world is ruptured by the intrusion, which disrupts normality and has to be negotiated with or defeated, sent back whence it came, or controlled. Often intrusive fantasies overlap with horror, and H.P. Lovecraft, shown here in fan art, is one of the best examples. Here's a brief foreshadowing excerpt from his 1936 novella, The Shadow over Innsmouth. It illustrates the pattern of intrusive fantasy, and also, I'm afraid, Lovecraft's shortcomings as a prose stylist. The door of the church basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside. And as I looked, a certain object crossed or seemed to cross that dark rectangle, burning into my brain a momentary conception of nightmare, which was all the more maddening because analysis could not shew a single nightmarish quality in it. This scene is classic intrusive fantasy, since the church is invaded by a monster, and the holy is invaded by the unholy. As often in Lovecraft, this scene foreshadows later discoveries by the narrator about the town of Innsmouth and its inhabitants, and of course, the narrator's descent into madness. Another intrusive fantasy occurs in a larger work by the ancient author Petronius. Petronius Arbiter, the Arbiter of Taste, Unavoidable. His werewolf story, often read by Latin classes near Halloween, follows the pattern of intrusive fantasy. In the following passage, the storyteller hears about a wolf from his girlfriend, then connects it to one of his friends, who is a werewolf. Melissa said, a wolf entered the farm and threw down all our sheep and let blood from them like a butcher. But he did not have the last laugh on us, even though he fled. Really, our slave stabbed his neck with a spear. When I reached home, my friend the soldier was lying in bed like an ox, and a doctor was working at his neck. I realized that he was a werewolf. I never could enjoy bread with him afterwards, even if he would kill me. The werewolf's ideal for intrusion, since werewolves typically roam from place to place, like wolves in the wild. Here the intrusion is contained if not defeated, but the pattern remains. Another fantasy type, the liminal fantasy, is like the portal fantasy, in that it features a means or method of reaching another world. But liminal fantasies differ from portal fantasies in featuring an element of refusal or failure to cross through the portal. More conceptually, Mendlesohn says that the liminal fantasy, quote, estranges the reader from the fantastic, as seen and described by the protagonist, end quote. The liminal fantasy is Mendelssohn's most original contribution to the theory of fantasy, and the term arose partly to account for unusual modern fantasies like John Crowley's 1981 novel, Little Big, whose cover is shown here. There's a realm of fairy parallel to our world, but the protagonists cannot cross into it. Here's a passage singled out by the novelist Lauren Oliver as especially beautiful and evocative. Quote, while the moon smoothly shifted the shadows from one side of Edgewood to the other, daily Alice dreamed that she stood on a flower-starred field, where on a hill there grew an oak tree and a thorn in deep embrace, the branches intertwined like fingers. Far down the hall, Sophie dreamed there was a tiny door at her elbow, open a crack, through which the wind blew, blowing on her heart. You hear in this passage how the other world shines into this one, but still remains out of reach. In the liminal fantasy, the other world remains both puzzling and inaccessible, strange from the reader. But in the ancient world, the liminal fantasy was quite popular and frequent. Odysseus' view of the underworld in Odyssey Book 11 has this element. He can see the ghosts in the underworld, but cannot cross into it unless he dies. In the image, he talks with his dead comrade Elpenor. Elpenor is sort of like Eutychus in the Book of Acts, in that he dies accidentally. But while Eutychus is resurrected, Elpenor merely achieves the burial of his corpse, which he asks for here. In the literary passage, I want to point out the weirdness or estrangement of how Odysseus is allowed to see and talk with the dead. But after I summoned the tribes with the dead, with my prayers and vows, I took the sheep and cut their throats over the trench. Dark, opaque blood began to flow, and the souls of the dead bodies rushed out from Erebus, another name for the underworld, brides and unmarried youths and old men who had endured a lot. Crowds were flitting around the trench on all sides with the divinely sweet noise. Again, the audience of the epic is supposed to find this scene disturbing and scary, and the epic does not vouch for the truth of this account. This book is narrated by the protagonist Odysseus as a flashback. All the remaining companions of Odysseus die in the next book, so no one's alive to verify the story. The audience is unsure how much the story is true, or an entertaining fiction intended to persuade the internal audience, King Alcinous and Queen Arete of Phaeacia, to provide Odysseus with transportation to his own home, in a land filled with those who are very much alive. Similarly, the ancient South Asian epic, the Mahabharata, features the hero Yudhishthira, shown a vision of heaven by the god Indra in a dream. Again, he cannot pass into heaven because he's not dead, yet he can see everything. He's particularly unhappy about the presence in heaven of his cousins. As shown in the slide, his cousins fix a dice game in which Yudhishthira gambles away his kingdom, and because he's a warrior, he cannot refuse a challenge, no matter how small. Later in the epic, his cousins would wage a brutal war against him, against Yudhishthira and his brothers, in which most of the soldiers die. Unsurprisingly, Yudhishthira has difficulty forgetting all his cousins' wrongs. For this the next passage, I've used a retelling by William Buck of Carson City, Nevada, because the retelling compresses the scene into a form that I can easily quote. Yudhishthira saw himself carried to heaven. With Indra, he entered Nandana Park, and they came upon the cool river Mandakini, the heavenly branch of the Ganges. Then Yudhishthira saw Duryodhana, his enemy, and Sakuni, the crooked dice player, and Dasasana, his enemy's sidekick, seated on magnificent thrones that dazzled his eyes. I will share no place with them. Take me to my brothers. Indra smiled. Bharata, you still have your human body, and this is why you still feel love for your brothers and why you dislike Duryodhana. But there can be no friendship or hatred with those who are dead. After refusing to remain in heaven, he tells Indra to go to hell, and Indra replies in kind. After a second vision of his brothers and everyone else he loves in a gruesome hell, which I won't quote here, Yudhishthira wakes up alive. The key thing for liminal fantasy is that he can see into heaven and hell without having to remain in either place. He can gain wisdom from these images, yet without further suffering. Mendelssohn deploys a fifth category, irregular, as a catch-all for the fantasy stories that do not fit her typology, but I'm going to leave that one to one side. Still, I hope I've shown the power of her typology for ancient literature. Another schema is the division between fantasy and science fiction, about which my daughters argue endlessly. This division is memorably defined by science fiction and mystery author Miriam Allen DeFord. Quote, science fiction deals with improbable possibilities, fantasy with plausible impossibilities. Fantasy includes, as we shall see, flying to heaven on a giant dung beetle in Aristophanes Peace, but science fiction in the Alexander romance includes giant glass diving bells. A flying giant dung beetle is a plausible impossibility, but a giant diving bell is an improbable possibility for reasons that I'll get into. The comedy piece talks about an impossibility, riding a dung beetle to heaven. But it seems plausible if you imagine a beetle large enough. I've tried to make this image as large as possible. Imagine riding like a horse. Also, it was not totally unprecedented even within the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians imagined a giant dung beetle pushing the dung ball of the world up out of the Nile. But in the context of this comedy, the purpose of riding the dung beetle to heaven is to fetch peace from the gods and to bring it back to classical Athens. At this point, Athens is in the middle of the Peloponnesian War against Sparta and desperately needs peace. In this passage, the protagonist's daughter is not so sure that riding a dung beetle would work. But what is your plan to harness a dung beetle and ride it to the gods, Daddy? In the stories of Aesop, it is the only winged creature found to have reached the gods. Father, you said an unbelievable tale that such a foul-smelling creature went to the gods. It went in order to get revenge by rolling the eggs of its old foe, the eagle, out of its nest. You ought to have harnessed the winged horse Pegasus to appear more tragic to the gods. But my dear, I would need twice the food. But now, whatever foods I myself eat, I will recycle the same foods into the meal. I want to highlight here the reference to the mythical winged horse Pegasus and to the tradition of animal fables identified with Aesop. Fantasy, more than science fiction, is related to mythology and folklore. Therefore, Peace counts as fantasy, albeit with a political edge and a poop joke. In contrast, the diving bell episode of the Alexander romance counts as science fiction rather than fantasy. The diving bell is an extension of existing technology, breathing buckets for divers, into a new invention. Sponge and pearl divers already used inverted buckets sealed with tar to breathe from and thereby to extend the time they could remain underwater. So this glass diving bell is an extension of the same principle to a much larger scale. This episode is set within an overall work that is a fictional elaboration about the historical Greek general, Alexander the Great. Its episodes tended to grow larger and more elaborate over time, even though Alexander always had to die at the end. There are versions of this work in 30 languages, but the technological marvel of the diving bell is not in every manuscript. This version comes from a fellow known as Leo the Archpriest. He's from Naples. He visited Constantinople in the 940s AD and made a Latin translation from a Greek manuscript. I ordered my wise men to build me a vessel in which I could sink into the depths of the sea and seek out amazing beasts that were living there. They kept saying that this could not be done except by such a means. We would make a barrel out of glass, and it would be fastened to chains, and the strongest soldiers would direct it, that is, haul it up and down. Once I heard this, I ordered them to make such things quickly, and by such a means I sought out the depths of the sea. There I saw different shapes of fishes, and fish of different colors. Note how the illustration shown here emphasizes the fishes, which are not magical sea monsters, but based on actual Mediterranean species, maybe enlarged a bit for visibility. Moreover, the historical Alexander the Great may have assigned what we might call frogmen to undermine the walls of the island city of Tyre, which is now in modern Lebanon, but the frogmen would have used the inverted bucket breathing technology rather than a diving bell or the compressed air tanks of modern frogmen. Nevertheless, to create a glass diving bell large enough to cover one's entire body and strong enough to be hauled up and down by chains was beyond the reach of ancient technology. It would be like a hoverboard capable of carrying its rider to the moon. Nevertheless, this episode counts as science fiction rather than as fantasy because its technology is not magic, but an extension of then current technology. Similar to the divide between fantasy and science fiction is the divide between philosophical schools in the ancient world, akin to some of the divides between Christian denominations in the modern world. One scholar, Adam Roberts, argues, quote, science fiction is determined precisely by the dialectic between Protestant and Catholic. or if one prefers less sectarian terms, between deism and magical pantheism that emerges out of the 17th century. You do not have to agree with that analysis to find the idea of dialectic useful for generating fiction. In the ancient world, the dialectic between philosophical schools generates ancient science fiction, at least partly because one side is as hostile to fiction as the character used to Scrub at the start of C.S. Lewis's novel Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Scrub is shown at left, with the more fiction-friendly Edmund. The opening moves of this dialectic are between the materialist philosophy of Democritus and his followers and the idealist philosophy of Plato. Democritus postulates a universe without gods, but only atoms and space between them, while Anaxagoras denied that the sun and the moon were divine and asserted that an impersonal principle, intelligence, or nous, animates and divides the universe. One fragment of Anaxagoras reads, quote, "And whatever sorts of things were going to be, and whatever sorts were, and now are not, and as many as are now, and whatever sorts will be, all these nous, that is intelligence, set in order." It's a powerful explanation or theory of everything, but not much of a narrative. In response, Plato, at the end of his Republic, brings human souls back to the foreground, where Homer had put them. The end of Plato's work is in the form of a vision of a warrior unconscious on a funeral pyre. Tolkien fans will note the similarity to the character Faramir in Return of the King. Note that the vision's in the form of a mythos or story about what happens to the good souls who enjoy reincarnation instead of eternal punishment. Then the souls slept. When midnight came, an earthquake and thunder had happened. Like shooting stars, they were all suddenly carried off, this way and that, to their birth. But he, that is, himself, was prevented from drinking the water of forgetfulness. By whatever path and how he returned to his body, he did not know. But despite this exciting narrative, the name of is not as important as his vision, and Socrates gives a moralizing coda. The myth is a way to backstop morality, to satisfy the demands of his interlocutors earlier in the dialogue, to prove that justice benefits the person who practices it. The following quote emphasizes pursuing justice as a consequence of believing that the soul is immortal and should not be defiled. We could save ourselves, and let us be persuaded by the story that we could. We will cross the river forgetting, and we will not defile our souls. But in my view, let us be persuaded to believe the soul to be immortal, capable of enduring all evil and all good. And we will always cling to the upward way and pursue justice with wisdom. But the main takeaway for this talk is not so much Plato's ethics and metaphysics, but how Plato uses a narrative with science fiction elements to promote an anti-materialist view. The second phase of ancient science fiction is motivated by the conflict between the materialist Epicureans, heirs of Democritus, and the idealist Stoics, who are closer to Plato. The Epicurean poet Lucretius repeatedly debunks ancient fiction or uses mythology as examples of unphilosophical, irrational behavior. Meanwhile, his mind travels through space to imagine what happens to a spear or javelin thrown from the edge of the universe. If someone at the edge of the universe should run forward to the farthest limits and cast a flying weapon, would you prefer it, hurled by strong force, to go where it has been aimed and to fly a long way? Or do you think that something could prevent or stop it? For you must admit and adopt one or the other. Either of these possibilities closes off escape for you and forces you to admit that everything lies open, with its limit removed. For whether there is something that blocks or brings about that the weapon does not go where it has been aimed and stops at the boundary, or whether it is brought outside, it did not set out from the edge. Whenever you think of this logic, it's clear that it's a thought experiment rather than fiction, almost the materialist answer to fiction. Follow a hypothetical proposition rather than a person. On the idealist side, the school of philosophy known as Stoicism invents new stories with new or radically repurposed material. These stories are closer to standing on their own as narratives rather than as examples or thought experiments, and they're much less materialist and more idealist, or even just more elaborate. Although the Roman philosopher Cicero is quite eclectic philosophically, his dream of Scipio offers the following picture of the harmonious universe, hidden from human perception, and this picture is more or less philosophically stoic. You see, all things are connected by 9 rings, or other spheres, of which the outermost one is the heavenly one, which which contains all the others, and which is the God himself, protecting and containing the others. For such great motions of the spheres cannot be moved in silence, and nature brings it about that the edges sound at a high pitch from one part and a low pitch from the other. Filled with the sound, the ears of humans have grown deaf to. Note here the action of the God and the role of human perception, or lack of perception. The universe has a lot more in it than atoms blindly colliding. While Cicero intended the idea of the ordered universe to reinforce existing political hierarchies, the idea of the music of the spheres has been far more influential. I even want to connect this idea to the musical scores of science fiction films, 2001 and Interstellar, where the music is key to the audience's experience of the story. And even before the end of this talk, we'll encounter the music of the spheres yet again. The idealist versus materialist, or Stoic versus Epicurean debate also plays out in the treatment of the underworld, derived from Homer's Odyssey, which for various reasons no longer had the oomph it once did. Lucretius debunks traditional ideas of the underworld in his claim that they represent humans trapped in their desires in this world. Not quite the idea that hell is other people, but the idea of appetites gnawing on the self, especially of love and of jealousy, is very influential, and as found in the following passage and in this image by Michelangelo. He also seems to mean it allegorically. Nor do birds pry to the body of giant Tityus as he lies in the underworld, but for us, here is the giant Tityus, whom the birds of appetite mangle as he lies in love, and the uneasy anxiety devours him, or worries to harry him with another body. Again, Michelangelo, author of the sketch, did not believe in pagan mythology, but found it useful as an artist for allegorized depiction of concepts like desire or dawn and night, in other words. In contrast, the more idealistic and stoic Virgil presents an underworld that is real and in many ways a corrective to what happens in this life. Virgil follows the end of Plato's Republic, quoted above, in the following passage. So the souls are trained by punishments, and they pay penalties for old crimes. When the wheel has turned through 1,000 years, the god calls out all these souls to the river of forgetting in a large battle line, so that they, not remembering, may see again the lofty dome of the sky, and they may begin to want to return to bodies. Although I'm discussing this scene under the umbrella of science fiction, elements like the river of forgetting seem much more markers of fantasy. Even though the underworld journey seems to be derived from fantasy, especially works like the world's oldest epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, underworld journeys are not automatically filed under fantasy. The more philosophical they are, the more they resemble science fiction. The literary theorist Darko Suvin has formulated an interesting definition of science fiction that relies on cognition and estrangement, also the title of his article. Suvin's definition is flexible enough to apply to ancient literature as well. The cognition part is a thinking through the consequences of a novum, or Latin as a new thing, a new technology, or a shift in the laws of nature. Estrangement is a feeling of unfamiliarity, of initial non-recognition of some feature of the story. There is some counter to the way things are, but rather than show conditions in the most realist way possible, they change some conditions in order to shed new light on our present situation. My favorite example is a rather obscure Arthur Clarke story called Wall of Darkness, where, spoiler alert, a planet turns out to be a 3D Mobius strip, the 3D equivalent of the shape shown here. It basically has only one half side. If you try to cross to the other side, the planet turns you around in the direction from which you came. Estrangement comes from recognizing that our own planet does not work like this, nor does the physical space that we experience. The cognition part is thinking how this topology might affect culture and psychology. In this particular planet, 2D Mobius strips, more like this one, appear throughout the culture of the planet, and the people of the planet build the titular wall of darkness across the edge to keep everyone from going insane by constantly getting turned around. Perhaps the takeaway from this story, or Clarke's point, is that our physical universe often works in counterintuitive ways, and that we often rely on oversimplifications of psychological comfort, such as the hot hand of basketball or gambling. The best example of cognition and estrangement is Lucian's true story. He's from the 2nd century AD, and he lived in what's now Iraq. In the opening of the work quoted here, Lucian begins to play hermeneutic games with the reader. Indeed, I am writing about what I did not experience or learn from others, the things that do not exist and still could not happen. Therefore, those who encounter these things must never believe them. Lucian not only narrates lies, he also wants them perceived as lies if anyone catches sight of anything like them. In other words, he wants a universe drained of wonder. Here's a sample of what he regards as unbelievable, or as a no one, a use of natural materials with a change of scale. On the 3rd day, we face the pumpkin pirates. These are wild men from the nearby islands who plunder their neighbors. But they have large boats made of pumpkin, 60 feet long. Whenever they dry out a pumpkin, they hollow it out, and having removed the guts, they sail in it. They use reeds as masts, and instead of a sail, they use a pumpkin leaf. So they began to fight us and disable many after they rammed us and kept attacking us with pumpkin seeds, instead of stones, from 2 squads. One might object that this is really a plausible impossibility, like the dung beetle in Aristophanes Peace, rather than an improbable possibility, like the Alexander Romance's Dodging Bell. But the mythological and folktale elements are toned down or absent, and some critics, such as Roberts, even consider this work a type of anti-science fiction, like its literary descendant Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. In other words, in thinking through the noble or new thing that Lucian introduces, the reader should end not in fascination, but in disbelief. The accompanying picture I want to say a few words about, it's the best illustration of this episode that I could find. It comes from an elementary school classroom, and the schools listed here, where the teacher assigned the children to write and illustrate sequels to Lucian's work, and these children added the element of mermaids from fantasy literature, or maybe from Disney. Note how the pumpkin pirates are still eager to fight. The teaching and learning going on here is brilliant, and I salute this teacher and her students. Still, Lucian would have a fit of apoplexy if he knew that his work was inspiring further fantastic tales, rather than skepticism about all such works. Another Darko Suvin article, Science Fiction in the Genealogical Jungle, tries to classify different types of fiction by such criteria as estrangement from everyday experience and the relationship of physics to the protagonist. As discussed above, fantasy and science fiction both focus on estrangement from everyday experience, rather than the familiarity of realistic fiction and even of historical novels. But fantasy differs from science fiction in that the laws of physics are not neutral toward the protagonist. Magic's the prime example in fantasy fiction, as in Earth's Old Winds, Earthsea series, or Harry Potter. But it's also true to some extent of the Star Wars films. Even though they feature lots of technological bells and whistles, the Force allows good or evil characters to bend the laws of physics in their favor. According to Suvin, science fiction features physics that are neutral toward the protagonist. With the right technology, one character can travel in time or faster than light, so can another character. The key example here, Doctor Who's machine, the TARDIS, which stands for Time and Relative Dimensions in Space. Humanoid species can travel on the TARDIS in time and space, even if their species has not discovered or understood any of the relevant technology. It's difficult to discover any instances of neutral physics in the ancient world. In ancient worldviews, gods caused earthquakes and storms, or philosophers ordered the universe around moral laws. But the following passage from a section of Plutarch's Moralia, often called On the Face of the Moon, seems to have a science fiction style neutrality of physics. But rather than being presented as common knowledge or as scientific reasoning, this passage is embedded in a longer tale told by Plutarch's friend Sextius Solid, a Roman from the city of Carthage, who heard it on an island far off in the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps related to Atlantis. Elsewhere in the work, Plutarch seems to know that the moon causes tides and that it's smaller than the Earth, but here he uses the moon for physics that affect metaphysics. Moreover, he makes the moon a sort of purgatory, to use Christian theological language, before souls are reincarnated, to use Hindu or Buddhist theological language. Figures such as the sinner Titius, the monster Typho, and the dragon-like python that occupied Delphi and disturbed the oracle were from that class of souls that were devoid of reason and relied on feeling led astray by delusion. But the moon reabsorbed and reformed even those souls over time. Then after the sun with his living force, his scattered intelligence, the moon receives them, produces new souls, and Earth in the third place produces bodies for them. Indeed, in this passage, physics outweigh ethics and theology, and evil is portrayed as against nature or even overcome by it. Given the pessimistic tenor of most ancient thought, this passage is unusually optimistic. I also want to talk about the image of George Méliès's early sci-fi film, Voyage dans la Lune, shows a cinematic descendant of Plutarch by a French translation, and the French sci-fi author Jules Verne. This Plutarch passage suggests perhaps why someone might want to visit the moon in the first place. More typical of ancient literary physics is another passage from the same work about eclipses. Here, ethics trump physics, even though souls long for what is ontologically better because it's eternal. Here, the observed phenomenon of a lunar eclipse is explained in moralizing terms. She, that is the moon, passes through the Earth's shadow with a small multiple of her own length, but not because the shadow is small. Rather, she quickens her motion more energetically in order to pass through the dark area quickly, because she carries away the souls of the good, who shout at her and hurry her along. You see, when they're in the shadow, they no longer apprehend the harmony that rings through heaven. We know, however, that the shadow of the Earth is in fact small, and smaller than the Earth itself, because the sun literally shines around it in the penumbra, shown here. The idea that souls yell at the moon to hurry up seems almost satirical. One could compare it perhaps to fans of chariot racing, yelling at their favorite driver and his horses. Or football fans, yelling at their favorite running back. Yet the harmony that rings through heaven is the music of the spheres again, which we've seen before. Unlike the people on Earth who do not hear this music, the souls in the moon are attuned to it. Why does this all matter? Christians in particular are practitioners of fantasy and science fiction in a way that others are not. The Catholic Tolkien and the Congregational/Anglican Langley helped change the game so that these genres are mainstream, and even haters of Christianity read these authors. Anglican Lewis wrote both fantasy and science fiction that remain popular. Orson Scott Card, a Latter-day Saint, wrote the immensely influential science fiction novel Ender's Game and its sequels, and he gave a talk at my Catholic high school. Science fiction and fantasy are all over Christian culture, wherever you draw the boundaries. Liking fantasy and science fiction is optional, but understanding it is not. Especially at this cultural moment, fantasy and sci-fi are in a dominant cultural position. Whether it counts as science fiction or fantasy, the new Star Wars movie is hugely popular, and my first grade neighbor and her friend were dressed up as young Princess Leia's, with white robes and cinnamon roll hairstyles. Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies, exemplars of fantasy, have spawned many imitations and references, even memes. One does not simply walk into Mordor. Yet one does not simply walk into ancient literature either, with the baggage of what we've already read. And sometimes what we find seems more than familiar. Science fiction and fantasy are especially familiar to us. In Harold Bloom's words, one can believe for startled moments that the modern authors are being imitated by their ancestors. So Aeneas' quest recalls Dorothy's quest from elf Frank Baum, and Lucian's strange worlds look like those of Arthur C. Clarke. If my talk has given you any other startled moments, I am grateful. Thank you for coming.
Professor Edwald has about 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll break for more intimate conversation with coffee and goodies. I'll let you go ahead. We have first question.
Peter.
Well, thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I want to ask you about Mendelssohn's four-part schematics that she offered at the beginning. And when I was hearing it, I thought that it was really useful for categorizing sci-fi and fantasy. But I had two questions about it. And the first was if those four categories can overlap. And the second is if it can extend beyond fantasy. An immediate example I thought of was the Book of Revelation, because it seems to have like all four of those qualities running throughout it, and it's like outside of this realm of fantasy sci-fi. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on like two questions of like how do these categories overlap, and then also are they useful in thinking about texts outside of just fantasy?
Off the top of my head, I'd say that most sci-fi is immersive. That is, you're already in this world. It's self-contained. Okay. Let's see. And that there's typically no way outside it, or even if you go through wormholes, you're still in the same universe. As for the question of whether they overlap, I think that definitely so. Or oftentimes, partly because of the capacity for included tales, or tale stories within stories. So I say that the overall story can be one genre, can be liminal, but then there might be intrusive or portal fantasies within it.
So where would you put, I mean, I know Revelation's outside of the scope of that schema, but where would you put Revelation?
Okay, so the overall framing narrative, the vision to John, that's definitely liminal.
But then it has all those other categories.
Right. But then the other,
Thank you.
yeah. You're welcome. Margaret.
What might be the Christian parallel to the river of forgetting? Or is that? Let me start with that.
Okay, perhaps again, maybe go back to Revelation, a place where there is no more pain or grief, but life eternal. And that there's, let's see, not necessarily that, that we necessarily disremember everything, but that it no longer troubles us in the same way. Perhaps going along with, again, not to get too deep into theology here, but with our glorified bodies, the renewal of everything.
So which one do you like better, science fiction or fantasy?
Oh, let's see. That would be like asking me which of my children I love. I guess I said that I've enjoyed different ones at different times in my life. So perhaps as a teenager, and I say more recently, more science fiction, but in between that, a lot of fantasy. And presumably, and I anticipate it probably at one point sort of returning, or rather I'd say having a binge reading fantasy.
In regards to the conflict between the Epicureans and Stoics, you described the Epicureans as the materialists, but I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding what's meant by materialism in this context.
I'd say concentrating especially on the things that we can touch. Basically, all perception boils down to touch. Even things like dreams, are kind of fragments of reality that we're perceiving kind of in a jumbled way. They make a small concession that the gods exist, but they exist far off in a realm that doesn't interfere with us. And basically what we see are kind of visions of them from afar, or that their atoms reach us, but they do not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I find it interesting from my background that you see this throughout this very long span of history. These genres are sort of apparent. What is it about them that we enjoy as humans? What is it that is common amongst all those different eras, those two different ways of viewing?
Perhaps it's the hypothetical. Let's say, imagine that something. What if something were different? What if something about the way, about either what we've experienced, okay, or the way the world works were different? That sense of what if, the world as it might be, I think is very appealing to us. Or I'd say that we, even though, as you know, we only imperfectly understand even what's in front of us, still thinking about what might be, because I think maintains its appeal.
And how does that, just to follow up, how does that relate to our discoveries as we discover in reality applications from these fictions and fantasies?
Or I'd say especially science fiction. There's a fair number of incidents where things have come true. For instance, geostationary orbit for satellites was basically proposed by Arthur Clarke. He didn't, there wasn't quite the capability of making it happen when he proposed it, but it came along a few years later. I'd say there perhaps is a difference between science fiction and fantasy. It's unlikely that we'll find werewolves. But it's definitely worth thinking about the relationship between stories and discoveries. Yes?
Maybe get the last. No, you can do one after.
I'd say mythology is relatively more systematic. Again, like the line isn't hugely bright. Let's see. I thought about including some of the appearances of the gods in various ancient epics as intrusive fantasy. But I rejected it because that's something that gods do. They show up when you least expect them. So that's almost sort of part of the worldview. Whereas things like a trip to the underworld, that's very exceptional. That's very out of the ordinary. That's very spooky. That's very different, qualitatively different from a lot of the other things that go on.
So, given the centrality of mythology in Greek life, why did fantasy develop? What was the cultural milieu that led to another type of genre?
Well, I'll say that, let's see, whereas the gods were a regular feature in their actions, causing earthquakes, causing people to fall in love, okay? Still, if that sort of becomes regular, it becomes old hat. And you've got to, as a creative artist, you've got to keep going for something that hasn't been heard before. So I'll say that's why it originates. Turkey.
Would you say they tend to be more dystopias or utopias over these stories? And having chosen one of those, why do you think, say, utopia or dystopia is more common?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think that also fluctuates historically. It seems a lot of the ancient ones, let's see, I'd say there are probably statistically more dystopias than utopias. That is, you could develop your underworld. You can populate your underworld in almost an infinite number of ways. But in some ways, the utopias are surprisingly influential. Things like the myth of Earth, the Plato one, gets redone by several people. Even some people have argued that the Matrix is a redoing of that. Sure. Yeah. Or I'd say that in the ancient world, the general tone was pessimistic, but there were a few bright spots. There were a few people looking up more optimistic. Yeah. Whereas I'd say perhaps now we're in kind of another dystopian era. Things like the Hunger Games. Yeah.
And Lucretius is the nature of things. He uses a lot of mixture of philosophical ideas, but also physics, and most notably the square that he explains. How was that perceived during that time period? Was that considered science fiction, or was that taken as physics?
I think taken as physics, or almost in opposition to all the other stories out there. Sort of an assertion of, as something that would rationalize and order all the various stories out there into one system that made sense. Not totally successful, and not especially popular, but at least out there. And we still have it. Yes?
I ask this as an aspiring storyteller. What is it about Tolkien, Langley, and C.S. Lewis, for that matter, that makes their work accessible to a general audience beyond fellow Christians?
I think part of it, especially with Langley, I'll answer that because I've read almost all her books. So, is that let's say the Christian elements aren't necessarily as overt as in some other authors, or that there's the appeal of fantasy literature, what might be, or say if you're traveling through a portal to some other place, people are willing to play along with that, much less than where will you spend eternity. I also want to recommend, even though if you're not explicitly asking this, Mendlesohn has some great advice for people working on fantasy literature. like i.e. pitfalls to avoid as you write. Or if you follow a liminal fantasy, okay, don't make these mistakes.
Yeah, I was curious if you came across, when you're looking at ancient fantasy and sci-fi, if you came across any distinction in their attitudes toward time. So, for example, modern theorists or critics on fantasy and sci-fi often make the distinction that fantasy is sort of set in the past, it's kind of backward-looking, almost reactionary, according to some critics, and sci-fi, of course, looking towards the future, often being kind of progressive, unless it's a dystopia, which is a whole other thing. But so I just wondered, did you, as you looked at the ancient fantasy and ancient sci-fi, was there a sense of the authors like looking backward towards the past, a lost past, or looking forward?
It seems that there's considerably less, or especially if you look at the science fiction ones, it's more about now rather than the future. And part of it is also how time travel appears in a lot of modern science fiction. It seems that the influence of Aristotle is very big there. The idea that the whole universe runs on the God clock, and basically there's no way to accelerate it or decelerate it. Seems to have been believed by pretty much all, both Greeks and Romans. Yeah. Perhaps there is a sense in which some of the fantasies do tend to be set a little bit more in the past, or are told in retrospect, a little bit more of a retrospective use. But again, I'd say it's not as pronounced. It's not a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Good question. Yes?
I was really struck by the music of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres, and some of that. That was just part of the Elizabethan, cosmology. They just really believed that was so with these concentric circles. But it reminded me of Mary Doria Russell's novel, and I can't remember the name. It's not
The Sparrow? Not the Sparrow, but another one.
The one where maybe those are connected, but where the people hear music. And so a diverse group of people are sent off in a spacecraft to track this music. And is that fantasy? Is that, portal? I mean, she just, that seems to me that novel might be all of those things. Because it's so reflective of so much. It's fascinating. But
And also, she has I think, a deep knowledge of the Western tradition. I would bet money that she's read Cicero.
Right. On that note, I want to thank you very much.